Hi there. So last night, instead of recording more of this, I spent the time trying to figure out how to make the sound work. And I think I made some headway. Graham helped me with some of the graphic and image stuff, and which I really appreciate. The sound stuff has to do with the fact that I have a Mac, and I had to deal with a plugin called Black Hole, if that is any kind of metaphor for the experience. So I'm going to continue. I'm going to backtrack a little. I had finished the section called What Evolution Says About Consciousness. But I'm going to backtrack a little because I don't think I said everything I wanted to say, and I think I cut off the end a little bit too. So let's get started with that.
And then it better look like evolution by natural selection. So the theory can tell you if you're wrong about your leap, right? But it can't tell you if you're right, and it can't tell you where to look for your leap. So I decided, you could imagine various ways to try to leap. I'm very interested in consciousness and what's called the hard problem of consciousness. How is consciousness related to physical systems like our brains or possibly artificial intelligences? And so I decided, instead of starting with physics and trying to boot up consciousness, since evolutionary theory tells me that space-time itself is just a user interface, let me start the other way. I'll start with a theory of consciousness on its own terms. So
All right, one thing I want to say is he's saying that the theory of evolution is a user interface. And he's also implied that any scientific theory is never going to be complete. So let's just say that every scientific theory, I think that entertaining the notion that every scientific theory is a user interface is yet another parallel or low or high quality way of describing reality. And this is a hard thing to convey, but during a particular point in time in history, one particular user interface is going to, oh, I'm sorry, I meant to do what Grimm told me to do, which is do this. So I'm talking like, my usual videos. You can see my whole thing. I don't know if that's even necessary or desirable, but I think it makes it a little bit more interesting. Any scientific theory is going to be imperfect. It's going to sort of encapsulate where human understanding consciousness is at this point in time. And that's not to disparage scientific theory, because the theory of evolution or the theory of physics as it stands in this point in time, or the space-time theory of, I guess that's Einstein, are all very useful tools. But since, and let's use the word apophatic, nothing is going to completely describe reality, because reality is a thing that presents itself to us in the moment. Now, they talk about Heidegger. I don't know if I could ever understand what Heidegger is trying to say. I don't think I have the brains for it, and I don't mean that to disparage myself in any kind of, false humility. I think that's a fact. That if I read Heidegger, I don't think that, it'd be useful for someone like me to try to make sense of Heidegger. But I suspect that Heidegger is saying something like that whatever interface or whatever theory we have whatever reality is presents itself to us in the moment as being itself, and being itself is going to take on different attributes depending on where we are in consciousness, where we are in history. And I think that these scientific theories depict where we are in terms of final reality, which we will never be able to get a complete handle on. We're never going to be able to pin down the final reality. Metaphysical, good metaphysics come as close as they possibly can to the one and the attributes of the one. So I hope that makes some sense. Let me move on.
Mathematical theory of consciousness, qua consciousness. So not most of my brilliant colleagues and friends who are working on this are starting with mathematical models of what physical systems must be like to create consciousness or to be consciousness.
And again, what he's talking about is they're starting with physical systems, meaning they're starting with the very smallest particle or the very smallest inorganic representation of reality. Meaning, like Persig would say, that is only one level. If you're like these particular physicists that he's talking about think that you can somehow get a model of reality from the smallest particle or even beyond that. And Hoffman is saying, no, that's not the case.
And evolutionary theory makes it clear that that game is dead. Those things aren't even real. They don't even, they're just interface symbols. So I'm not going to start with trying to.
But it's not just evolutionary theory that's saying that. The whole history of spiritual, metaphysical, philosophical understanding says that no theory can posit reality. And it's not space-time that's, it's not that space-time is dead. It's that space-time was never really alive. It was only a model. And now that this model has kind of outlived its utility. That's, I think, what he's saying.
What does a system in space and time have to have so that it could create consciousness? I'm not doing that. I'm saying let's start with a theory of consciousness on its own terms. What do I mean by consciousness? What's the minimal mathematical posit that I could make?
So when he says minimal mathematical posit, how can you reduce this understanding of consciousness, of reality, or the way we see reality, to its basic form? And this is why I like Persig. And this is why I think Pageau's metaphysics really line up with Persig's, because they are the one and the attribute. Meaning, there's the one, the ineffable one, and the only thing we're ever going to be able to perceive is the attribute, which it has to be a division. It has to be a dualism. Now, that's not to say that non-dualism is, something that we that is not valid. But it means that in order for us to perceive, we have to perceive value, which means we have to perceive a dualism, which means when you say the first basic division is heaven and earth, is matter and spirit, that's the only way within our limited perception as beings, as physical beings with a limitation in that regard. That's the basic structure that you have to begin with. So he's saying consciousness in the same way, I think, that the Neoplatonists would say the one, or that Pageau would say God. To Hoffman, he's trying to say consciousness is a depiction of God for a scientist who is open to the inability of any theory ever completely describing reality. I know I'm repeating myself, but as Paul van der Klee said, this is thinking out loud.
To boot up a full-fledged theory of consciousness. And so that's where I and my colleagues, Chetan Prakash, Manish Singh, Robert Prentner, Chris Fields, and others that I work with, have come up with this idea of conscious realism and started working on this mathematical model of consciousness. And ultimately, the goal then is to show how the dynamics of conscious agents, where we're assuming that that's the fundamental reality for now, right?
When he says conscious agents, that means consciousness and that which has consciousness. So consciousness being the one, and the agents perceive, the agents being able to perceive through consciousness. This is, for a scientist like Donald Hoffman, the essential divide. This is the heaven and earth divide, but in terms of a scientist. When it comes to the mathematics of consciousness, perhaps, and I'm only surmising this, but perhaps Jonathan Pageau is a little bit put off by this. But I think that if you're looking at spirit and matter, if you appreciate, like Donald Hoffman does, if you appreciate consciousness as the one, then you're looking at upholding consciousness as the one through matter, which means mathematics is allowed in that space. Mathematics is allowed in the space of matter, in the space of Earth, let's say, and that's valid. So, doing a mathematical assessment of matter, or being in the world in a physical entity, in physicalism, is a perfectly valid way of giving reverence to the spirit, the consciousness, that is imbued to matter through spirit. Does that make sense?
The way I don't think science could ever give us a full theory of truth. So there's no final theory of everything from science, but we can talk about that later. But right now, this theory would then be as far as we've gotten so far, and we would have to then show how space-time and what we call physical objects arise as some kind of projection of the dynamics of conscious agents. So we would have to get back all of quantum field theory. We have to get back evolution by natural selection, or our theory of consciousness is wrong. So that's sort of the two-step picture. And it's good that you start with that, because a lot of people, here's one objection that I've gotten from a friend of mine and a very, very brilliant philosopher, Philip Goff. He says, look, on the one hand, you're saying that evolution says that we don't see reality as it is. And on the other hand, you're saying that when I look at someone's face, I can get genuine insights into their conscious experiences. That seems to be a self-contradiction. And you can see now why it's not.
So, right there, he's talking about spirit and matter. If you look at someone's face, meaning, that is spirit. That's how you can even evaluate matter at all, is because spirit allows you to do it. Spirit allows you to look at someone's face and get a sense of what that person is perceiving.
Evolution tells us we're not seeing reality as it is. Then I say, okay, next step. Okay, what is reality? Well, if it's consciousness, then the interface would be an interface to consciousness. So it wouldn't be a surprise that we would have some true insights into consciousness if that's what the interface is to. So that's why it doesn't self-contradict. The first is a theorem from evolution. The next is a leap beyond evolution. But the constraint is this leap better project back down to space-time and give me evolutionary theory as a special case.
When he says project, that means attribute, in my opinion. That means that the projection is some kind of, this is so hard to explain, but I think this is, if we're looking at these Neoplatonic ideas and we're looking at the attribute of the ineffable one, it has to be a projection. So I think the word projection is a beautiful way of actually describing it. It's describing how the one manifests in us as limited physical beings.
That resolves that kind of apparent contradiction.
Okay, so I think that my biggest question then comes in relation to what you've just explained. That is, if our perceptions, if our capacity to perceive doesn't give us access to reality per se, or objective reality, fundamental reality per se, and that in order to fix that, or in order to find a solution to that problem, you're looking at consciousness as the originator of phenomena, as the basis of phenomena. Why do you continue to posit this reality? Why do you continue to say it doesn't give us access to reality? I don't know if you understand it. I find that it creates in me at least a lot of confusion, which is that other people that I'm interested in very much, who seem to see the fundamental consciousness as the fundamental, let's say, axiom, will take on something like a modified phenomenological approach, which is that they will take phenomenology as a basic framework, which is that being presents itself to me. Being presents itself to me, to my consciousness, and I engage with it with something we could call conscious agency, that is care. Thinking about Heidegger in particular, like something like care, something like desire.
Care, of course, being quality. Care, of course, an interest. Care of wanting something. Oh, sorry. Wanting something that's better. And I think he's saying that what he thinks Hoffman is doing is putting the physical, is putting the spiritual subservient to the physical. He's saying what you're doing is assuming that this objective reality is actually, is actually what you're searching for, rather than saying objective reality, let's say, presents itself and unfolds to us in a kind of dynamic sense, the objective reality being the combination, like the static dynamic combination that we're talking about, that unfolds and that changes over time, changes over as consciousness, as human consciousness evolves, that it's always that dynamism, that interplay in between pattern, beginning with the pattern of reality, let's say, that sort of spontaneously generates in front of us. And I think he's saying that, Don, what you're saying is you're being kind, but ultimately you do believe that there is an objective reality.
Or something like purpose. All of these categories will then generate the world. And so, the idea, for example, that objects don't have identities apart from their purposes in consciousness, something like that.
So that means that objects have meaning. And this is very much a Persigian sense. This is very much what Jordan Peterson says. When the child has the falling off place, it's not a cliff. It's just this quality that's given. It's low quality, the falling off. So it generates in our perception spontaneously. Now, if it generates in our perception spontaneously enough to become a pattern, then that pattern is a strong pattern. It's a pattern of value, and we all agree upon that pattern. But the mistake is saying that this is a fixed objective reality, when in fact this is a pattern that is enduring, that is long lasting, but isn't necessarily permanent. What is permanent, to the best of our perception as, again, limited physical beings in the universe, is they seem enduring to us because we're limited. So our limitation makes these limited patterns seem permanent. And the big mistake is to think that they are permanent.
And so what I find difficult is that when you continue to say that a consciousness doesn't give us, and you could say something, what I hear from you often is that consciousness doesn't give us access to reality. And then you turn around through our perceptions, and then you turn around and you say consciousness might be the fundamental axiom of phenomena. I don't know if you understand the quandary that I have in the formulation.
Well, I think so, and it gets back to the first thing that we were discussing, and that is, I should say right up front, I don't know whether our senses show us reality or not. I don't know. All I know is that evolutionary theory tells me that they don't, right? And also physics tells us that space-time isn't fundamental.
So what? So he's still implying that there is something that's going to reveal ultimate reality to us. I don't know if this does or it doesn't, but he's still implicitly saying there is a fundamental reality, and these particular theories don't necessarily describe it. But you see what Jonathan Pageau is saying? He's saying, but you're still saying that that fundamental reality exists, when in fact it doesn't.
Which is the sort of the foundation of our current perception. So now those theories may be false, but they're the best that we have so far. So as a result of those theories, I'm saying that those theories tell us we don't see reality as it is. Now I take another step and I say, okay, well, I'm not going to say that there is no such thing as reality. And I like the kind of thing that you're talking about, the phenomenologists and Heidegger and so forth. That's perfectly fine with me.
But do you believe that Don Hoffman doesn't think there is a fundamental reality? I think that this was what Pageau is kind of worried about, right? You know, that ultimately, despite the fact that Don Hoffman is extremely gracious about the transient nature of these scientific theories, that actually at the bottom of it, he thinks there is a fundamental reality. Now, I don't know if that's true, so I should say, I don't know if Don Hoffman believes there's a fundamental reality, but I think that this is Pageau's suspicion.
Uh, and there's nothing in what I'm saying about consciousness that would contradict them. What I'm doing that's different from the phenomenologists and Heidegger and so forth is I'm saying if we want to say that consciousness and psychological and conscious experiences and so forth are fundamental, as a scientist, I know that that has been said for thousands of years by various religious and spiritual traditions. So in some sense, there's nothing new. What's new from the science point of view is we're going to take that mathematically seriously. We're saying that consciousness is fundamental. If that's the case, then we owe a precise mathematical theory of what we mean by that. Because
All right, now I'm going to put myself in Pageau's head again. Why? Why do we owe consciousness, I mean, with this reverence for consciousness, why do we owe it this mathematical parallel? Well, I think there's two ways to see this. I see Pageau's side, but I also I'm going to repeat what I said before, which is on the level of matter, to make it mathematical precise is reverence to the ineffable. To say, as limited physical beings, counting and calculating is as close as we can get to to understanding this in terms of matter. So on the one hand, Pageau's going to say, no, you can't do that because you're never going to be able to pin it down, because this is this is a reality that generates itself. This is a reality that generates itself according to value. So if you're trying to pin it down with something that you can refer back to, like a list, or like a set of attributes, reality is this attribute, and that the mathematics tell us that, then that's wrong. But at the same time, what else do you have when it comes to matter, to the level of matter? So if Donald Hoffman is saying the mathematics is precise as we can get, as close, it's a type of metaphysics, then that's actually a good thing. And it would depend on whether Don Hoffman thinks there is an ultimate reality, or whether he is using mathematics as a sort of reverential desire to say that this ineffable and phenomenological spontaneous generation of reality is something that's worth at least giving us an interface, being mathematics, so that we can integrate it into the scientific world and give it the reverence that it's due.
In some sense, we would like to have a falsifiable and testable theory, and we'd also like to avoid dogmatism. We would like to just not spin our wheels in the same circles for thousands of years. We would like to actually find out.
If you have a testable and non-falsifiable theory, then what I think what Hoffman is trying to say is he's looking for metaphysics. He's looking for a metaphysical structure. And in science, this mathematical precision is that metaphysics. So in a way, they're on the same page. In a way, they're not.
Or we're wrong as quickly as possible. So that's why I go for this mathematical model of consciousness. So I don't think that it's at all contradictory to phenomenology or many philosophical points of view. In some sense, it's saying, let's take those points of view seriously enough that we're going to actually turn them into mathematical precise theories that we can test and find out their strengths and their failures. So I would just say that so far it sounds like we're on the same page.
And that's kind of what I'm saying. Taking it seriously enough means, having reverence for it. This is a productive step forward. I mean, it could go wrong. It could go to the point where we get so enamored of the math that we forget the phenomenological aspect of it, that we forget that the math is about consciousness and we go for the math. I think that is something that is a danger.
All right, and so I think that was, in a way, that was my biggest question, because so I've heard you formulate things. For example, so these are the types of questions that come up when I listen to you, and so sorry, I'm not focusing on the more exciting parts of what you're saying, because those I get and I'm excited about, and it's more the questions that I have, and so
Sure.
So I've heard you say something like, when you look at you say you look at a car and then the car exists, and when you turn around, the car ceases to exist. And so these types of let's say formulations really boggle my mind. That is because one aspect, let's say one projection of consciousness, is something like memory. And when I say memory, I mean it also almost in a Platonic sense. That is, I don't want to argue, let's say, for the theory of the form, but there's a manner in which we commonly remember identities, and
when he says memory and commonly remember identities in a Persigian sense, he's talking about patterns of value.
In consciousness, let's say across each other, we participate in identities. So for example, the identity of a car exists across my consciousness and my relationship to other consciousnesses, because I have, right, I learned what a car is from my parents, I learned from a car is from, and so the idea that the car ceases.
Do you remember when Percy was talking about ghosts? So there's a ghost that we've passed on to each other in a particular period of time, the past 100 years, a pattern of value, the car. And we pass on this pattern of value as a car. Now this car updates and changes, and soon changes into something that isn't a car. It begins to fly, it begins to not need gas. At one point it needed a crankshaft, and now we're at a point where it may not need fuel at all. We're going to get to some point where it may harness, the energy of the universe, let's say. The technology around a car is so dynamic. And we're seeing that happen right before us. Why do you think Tesla and whatever Tesla's doing is such a huge deal? Is because they're kind of tapping into this object, let's say this pattern of value you would call a car, and updating it with a very high quality, let's just say this pattern of value you would call a car is a high quality pattern of value because it's enduring in the sense that it's lasted for whatever amount of time. because it transports us in all these ways. The low quality part would be it begins to, it's destructive to the environment. So someone like Elon Musk or Tesla or whoever says, no, we can actually power this vehicle without just destroying the environment.
Exist when I don't look at it, to me is seems like a very, very bold statement. And so maybe you can expand a little bit on that, or let's say, in what manner does the car continue to exist when I don't look at it? Because at least it exists in my memory, at least it exists in, let's say, my knowledge that other people also know that the car continues to exist.
Right. So I'm not denying that there's some aspect of reality that continues to exist whether or not I perceive it. There is some reality. It's just that what I perceive in my senses is not that. It's just an interface to that reality. And what my interface is doing is very much like if you have a virtual reality headset on, and you're playing a game like Grand Theft Auto in virtual reality mode, and I turn my headset to the right and I see a red Camaro. Well, in that context, in that metaphor that I'm using, the reality I'm interacting with is a supercomputer with lots of voltages, magnetic fields in it, and so forth. And when I'm actually turning my steering wheel and turning my head and looking around, I'm really toggling tons of, millions of voltages rapidly in some supercomputer. But what I see is a red Camaro. Now, there is no red Camaro in that supercomputer. So that red Camaro only exists when I turn my head.
So what he's saying, of course, is that red Camaro is just as real to you in this particular context as an actual red Camaro. And there, he's certainly got a point there.
Set and create it. And then when I turn my headset that way, that red Camaro existed nowhere else except in my perceptions. So and since it's no longer in my perceptions, it doesn't exist. It might exist, of course, in my memory, as you point out, but as a current sensory experience, it no longer exists. And I'm saying that that's just what's obviously true in virtual reality is, in fact, what's also true in everyday life. We're wearing a headset. From an evolutionary point of view, our senses evolved to be a headset, not a window.
And that's right, but the big difference is a car is real in the sense that it's a physical, inorganic, a mixture of inorganic material, intellectual concept, biological efficiency, whereas all the thing that the red Camaro does in the virtual reality or in the video game is mimic that. And that's a big deal. And I don't think, and as Jonathan Pageau is saying, the actual physical reality of a car is different, engaging all levels of quality, inorganic, biological, intellectual, whereas in virtual reality, we may react to that car as if it is this actual item, but it isn't that actual item. And he's right about that. And so I understand the problem he's having with Donald Hoffman's theory right here.
On the truth. And just like any headset, you render what you're looking at as you need it, and then you garbage collect it when you don't need it anymore, and you get rid of it. And that way you don't keep all this structure around. The fact that we tend to agree, like suppose I play a game of virtual reality tennis with you, and I hold up a tennis ball and you say, yeah, I'm ready, and I hit the tennis ball and you hit the tennis ball back. It sounds as though there's a single existing tennis ball, one and the same.
And you know what? This is the problem of looking at things strictly through the lens of consciousness, right? Yes, this has the same effect on consciousness in a way, and consciousness is telling us what what we perceive, but this is engaging a narrow sliver of consciousness, whereas the actual car itself isn't. The actual car itself is engaging us in a full-bodied way.
tennis ball that you perceive and I perceive, but in fact, there's not. In my headset, I'm looking and creating the tennis ball as I need to. You're creating your tennis ball when you need to. There's no green tennis ball inside the computer, the supercomputer that's running this whole thing, but it coordinates our perceptions such that we have the useful illusion of a single tennis ball.
All right, so that's all I'm going to do for tonight. I hope that makes sense, and I will see you next time.